At one point, Joe Rogan said that he remembers as a child of repeatedly hearing on the news scary stories about the world will soon freeze and become one big ball of ice.
When I was a child, I do remember Leonard Nimoy had a television show called In Search Of. Remember that show?
Sure.
And on that show, he warned of an oncoming ice age.
During the lifetime of our grandchildren, Arctic cold and perpetual snow could turn most of the inhabitable portions of our planet into a polar desert.
And then, somewhere along the line, it became global warming.
This is Climate Debrief, brought to you by the CO2 Coalition. I'm Angela Wheeler. In a moment, we'll be speaking with CO2 Coalition member Dr. Daniel Nebert. A Wesleyan University graduate, Dr. Nebert earned his Master of Science in Biophysics and MD from the University of Oregon Medical School, followed by a pediatric residency at UCLA and a postdoctoral fellowship at the National Cancer Institute. From leading the Laboratory of Developmental Pharmacology at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development to his role as a professor of environmental health at the University of Cincinnati until his retirement in 2013, Dr. Nebert has published over 660 papers with more than 84,000 citations by his peers. A fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and recipient of the 2025 Richard T. Jones Distinguished Alumni Scientist Award, his work continues to shape medical science. Dr. Nebert, it's an honor to have you on Climate Debrief. I touched upon a bit of your impressive background in our introduction, but I would love to have you provide some details.
Thank you. After primary school in a small farming community near Portland, Oregon, I was awarded a full scholarship to Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. This was followed by 5 years at the University of Oregon Medical School. Consequently, over a period of 8 years, I had obtained the BA, MS in biophysics and MD degrees. I then completed pediatrics internship and residency at UCLA before entering the military service for my obligatory 2 years. Fortunately, I spent those 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow in the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, instead of Vietnam. I was then hired by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development in 1968, where I spent the next 21 years heading a laboratory of developmental pharmacology and genetics of drug metabolism. Besides being board qualified in pediatrics, I also became board qualified in human genetics. In 1989, I joined the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine and Cincinnati Children's Hospital as professor, where I continued until retirement in 2013. In 1992, I founded the Center for Environmental Genetics, which has continued until this year. In 2008, I was director of a novel gene-environment interactions training program and began an educational email blog for graduate students and postdoctoral fellows. This has continued to this day with more than 200 participants worldwide. Directly and indirectly between 1990 and 2014, I brought in far more than $100 million in federal grants to the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. Over the years, I've won about a dozen national and international awards. As a physician scientist, pediatrician, and geneticist during my career, I have authored and co-authored more than 660 publications in the fields of clinical medicine, biochemistry, biophysics, pharmacology, drug metabolism, molecular biology, cancer, standardized gene nomenclature, developmental toxicology, mouse genetics, human genetics, and most recently, evolutionary genomics. My lab is credited with the successful mouse and human gene cloning of one receptor, 2 enzymes, and 2 cation uptake transporters. All of these knockout and knock-in mice and cloning constructs are now being shared with drug companies that are trying to find breakthrough treatments involving common as well as numerous rare clinical disorders. As of November 2025. My Google Scholar H-index is 140. For those that are not familiar with this value is among the top 1% of all scientists in the world, with more than 84,200 citations by my peers. Last year, Research.com ranked me among the top 125 genetics researchers in the world and among the top 70 in the United States.
Dr. Nebert, with such a successful and rewarding lifelong career in genetics, I'm sure many have asked you, why did you ever jump into the field of climatology? And why would you want to join the CO2 Coalition?
Now, the answer to that question involves a very personal matter. My firstborn son, Douglas, with a degree in geography, began working for the U.S. Geological Survey, USGS, in 1982. His major assignment was to record and analyze global atmospheric temperatures that are constantly being monitored by satellites since the late 1970s. He also spearheaded internet cloud technology for the USGS and was honored for his innovative originality. Although he and I constantly traveled worldwide to meetings in our respective fields, we amazingly kept in very close contact by email. He enjoyed his USGS position, but often complained about, in his words, the disconnect between his scientific data measurements and the USGS public policy reports that always seemed to contain shadowy political overtones. I specifically recall his unhappiness toward a comment by President Obama in January 2014.
But they're wasting everybody's time on a settled debate. Climate change is a fact. And while we know the shift to clean energy won't happen overnight, we got to make some tough choices along the way.
Since the early 1990s, I had begun writing op-ed articles in several newspapers describing this disconnect between solid climatology data and politically slanted climate science. If my article was a particularly good one, I would share it with Doug. When I asked Doug why he didn't write an op-ed article for a newspaper about this disconnect, he cited the 1939 Hatch Act, which limits certain political activities of federal employees. In other words, he was afraid of losing his job and retirement benefits, and rightly so. On the last day of May 2014, Doug suddenly died in the crash of an airplane he had built from a kit several years previously. We often had silly arguments comparing the upsides and downsides of playing golf versus flying airplanes as hobbies. To this day, when I'm playing golf near a small airport, every time a small private plane flies over, I still look up and try to identify the model of the aircraft. Perhaps to ease my extreme grieving, I decided to pick up Doug's staff and march forward, becoming more active with publishing more frequent op-ed newspaper articles on global warming and climate change. As an aside, in psychiatry, my behavior in response to Doug's sudden death could be termed sublimation, which is a defense mechanism whereby socially unacceptable emotions, such as extreme grieving, are constructively transformed into socially productive activities, such as becoming active in this field. What struck me as being so different between my career in genetics and Doug's career in climate science.
So Dr. Nebert decided to turn a tragedy into something productive.
However, is extreme precision and truth in my field versus the political overtones and outright disinformation in his field. In genetics, if the genetic sequence of some gene is, for example, CCGTAT, and you publish a sequence as CCGTTAT, in other words, insertion of one extra DNA base, this mutation might mean the difference between a normal, healthy child and a patient affected with a serious disorder or rapidly terminal illness. In contrast, global warming alarmists can be as disingenuous as they wish. and their friends who review their papers before publication will simply let them write anything. Before the end of 2014, because of my increased visibility as a critic of climate change research, I was invited to join the Global Warming Realists email chat group, comprising several hundred scientists and engineers worldwide. During those next few years, I learned a lot in the field of climatology. This led to my being invited in 2019 to join the CO2 Coalition Education Committee, where I've continued to help out to this day in scientific education as opposed to indoctrination of school children.
Dr. Nebert, in our meetings, several times you've brought up the topic of eco-anxiety. Could you please expand on the meaning of this clinical term?
Yes, as a pediatrician and a physician scientist, I'm happy to discuss this. Eco-anxiety is a clinical disorder in which the patient exhibits pathological distress caused by social media's constant bombardment of global warming and global change and climate change fear-mongering, to the extreme point that patients have become seriously anxious about their future. This disorder, for example, might be manifested as nightmares in young children, bedwetting in a 6-year-old, increased anxiety, depression at any age, post-traumatic stress disorder, lower birth rates, higher rates of suicide, substance abuse, social disruption, including increased violence, a distressing sense of loss, acting disrespectfully toward adults in positions of authority at school or in public, poor grades, frequent tardiness and days absent from school, commitment of petty crimes, decreased desire to date or get close to someone of the opposite sex, not willing to plan for a future marriage or having children or buying a house, carrying out risky behavior, and reduced number of personal relationships and friendships, etc., etc. After all, if the world is soon coming to an end as we know it, what is the need to plan for a distant happy future? Such patients are seen and require treatment in clinics every day, and these visits have become more frequent since the 1980s, undoubtedly because of the ever-increasing exposure to the out-of-control social media. There's also a genetic predisposition component. In other words, some kids are easily frightened by what they hear and see on social media, whereas others take such scary news with a grain of salt. It's the often described nature versus nurture that we constantly see in medicine. Last month, during a podcast with Professors Richard Lindzen, and Will Happer, at one point Joe Rogan said that he remembers as a child, around 1970, of repeatedly hearing on the news scary stories about the world will soon freeze and become one big ball of ice.
When I was a child, I do remember Leonard Nimoy had a television show called In Search Of. Remember that show?
Sure.
And on that show, he warned of an oncoming ice age.
Right.
Do you remember that? And I remember being a kid and freaking out like, oh my God, Spock is telling us the world's going to freeze. This is terrifying.
During the lifetime of our grandchildren, Arctic cold and perpetual snow could turn most of the inhabitable portions of our planet into a polar desert.
And then somewhere along the line, it became global warming.
The global cooling fear-mongering of the 1970s then changed by the 1980s to global warming fear-mongering, which continues to intensify today, undoubtedly because of the constantly increasing bombardment by social media of world catastrophes happening now or predicted in the very near future. I recall the 1918 comment by the American journalist, critic, and satirist H.L. Mencken. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed, and hence clamorous to be led to safety, by menacing them with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. Among my colleagues, I keep hearing wishful thinking optimists saying that perhaps this insanity in public fear-mongering is coming to an end. However, a shocking article in the journal Bioscience published just within this last month by Oregon State University professor William Ripple, a PhD, and 12 other co-authors, stated the following in their abstract. We are hurtling toward climate crisis. The planet's vital signs are flashing red. The consequences of human-driven alterations of the climate are no longer future threats, but are here now. This unfolding emergency stems from failed foresight, political inaction, unsustainable economic systems, and misinformation. Almost every corner of the biosphere is reeling from intensified heat, storms, floods, droughts, or fires. The window to prevent the world's worst outcome is rapidly closing. In early 2025, the World Meteorological Organization reported that 2024 was the hottest year on record. This was likely hotter than the peak of the last interglacial period, roughly 125 years ago. Rising levels of CO2, carbon dioxide, and other greenhouse gases remain the driving force behind this escalation. These recent developments emphasize extreme insufficiency of global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mark the beginning of a grim new chapter for life on Earth. Wow. If this abstract is not enough to cause any 6-year-old to wet the bed every night, I don't know what is. As a pediatrician, I would accuse these co-authors of this publication as being guilty of child abuse.
I imagine you could tear apart each of the sentences in this abstract, but perhaps you could choose one statement and expand upon the reasons that their conclusions are wrong.
Yes, every sentence in that abstract is wrong. The authors are very concerned that global atmospheric CO2 levels, which were around 280 parts per million in 1750, are now around 420 parts per million today. And this is why we are hurtling toward climate chaos. In Earth's history, however, the highest levels of atmospheric CO2 were 6,000 parts per million to 9,000 parts per million, which occurred during the early Paleozoic era, about 550 million years ago to 450 million years ago. At that time, it caused plant life to flourish. Ice core data in Greenland and Antarctica over the last 800,000 years show that there's no correlation between global warming or global cooling and atmospheric CO2 levels. As a physician, I'm aware that CO2 levels in our lungs reach 40,000 parts per million to 50,000 parts per million, which induces us to take our next breath. So I wondered what would be the total CO2 output per day of all life on Earth. Each human exhales about 2.3 pounds of CO2 per day, which means that Earth's 8 billion people produce daily 18.4 billion pounds of CO2. How much CO2 would we have if we include all animals and fungi on Earth that constantly excrete CO2? A recent publication on the web by the Copernicus.org estimated that the human contribution is 176 times less than all CO2 excreting life on Earth. Therefore, multiplying 18.4 billion pounds by 176 gives us 3,238 billion pounds of CO2 per day. This number approximates the overall CO2 excreted by the total biomass, animal and fungal life cycles on Earth. How does this total biomass produce CO2 per day compare with worldwide industrial CO2 emissions per day? I found a table in Wikipedia that estimated human industrial CO2 production in 2022 to be 38.5 billion metric tons per year. If 1 metric ton is 2,200 pounds, then total industrial emissions equals about 84.7 trillion pounds per year, or 232 billion pounds of CO2 per day. This means that the CO2 levels produced by Earth's total biomass, 3,238 billion pounds per day, are almost 14 times higher CO2 than that by all worldwide industrial emissions, which is 232 billion pounds per day. I was so flabbergasted by this result that I asked my colleagues Chuck Leese and Will Haber to independently confirm that my calculations were accurate, and they were correct. So here we have hysterical global warming alarmists screaming about the CO2 levels generated by industrial emissions when the CO2 levels produced by all life on Earth are almost 14 times higher. Unbelievable. All our ice core records suggest that natural emissions and absorptions have been nearly the same over the past 10,000 years of the Holocene epoch, which began 11,700 years ago, with global atmospheric CO2 levels averaging between 280 parts per million and 320 parts per million during this time. It was only during the past 200 years that CO2 levels have started to increase substantially. Today, as I mentioned, we are at about 420 parts per million. What is the source of this additional 140 parts per million? Truthful climatologists would suggest that industrial emissions might have contributed 135 of this 140, with natural causes accounting for the other 5 parts per million. Much of these natural causes likely represent increases in human, farm animal, and large wild animal populations on the planet during the last two centuries. Nevertheless, all the unemotional scientific evidence shows that increased CO2 levels have been very good for life on Earth. Can any clear-thinking person comprehend these facts that I've just given and still plan to create a company to sequester CO2 or to sequester carbon? Scientifically, net zero and carbon capture and carbon footprint are meaningless terms. There is no climate crisis. Lastly, Princeton University physicist Will Haber defines a greenhouse gas as a gas that absorbs negligible incoming sunlight but captures a substantial fraction of thermal radiation as it is radiated from Earth's surface and atmospheric greenhouse gases back into space. The top 5 most important greenhouse gases include water, CO2, ozone, methane, and nitrous oxide. The gases of nitrogen, oxygen, and argon, comprising 78%, 21%, and 0.93% respectively of Earth's atmosphere, show negligible absorption of thermal radiation and therefore are not classified as greenhouse gases. Water vapor, for example in clouds, exhibits at least 10 times greater warming effect on Earth's temperature than all other greenhouse gases combined.
In other words, clouds and water vapor have a larger impact than human industrial output.
If you try to confirm these facts on the internet, good luck. Out of every 10 hits on any climate topic, you'll be lucky to find 1 or 2 sites with truthful scientific data among a flood of disinformation. This reminds me of a poster on the door of a nearby middle school classroom where my second-born son teaches. There is a poster of Abraham Lincoln with the caption, "Don't believe everything you read on the internet." It is advice that Abe Lincoln surely would have offered today had he lived to see the rise of this global warming quasi-religion.
Dr. Nebert, this has been a very enlightening discussion. Thank you for taking the time to share your expertise and experience on Climate Debrief.
Thank you for watching. The Climate Debrief podcast is funded by listeners like you. If you enjoyed listening to this episode of Climate Debrief, please like, comment, and subscribe. We read all of your feedback. If you are interested in finding out more about the CO2 Coalition and its mission, visit our website at co2coalition.org. Our host and executive producer is Angela Wheeler. Production by Ethan Audie and Scott Wheeler. Technical production and editing by Joseph von Spakovsky.